But we know, using that accommodation example, we know again that not everyone has the luxury or the privilege to be diagnosed as neurodivergent as a child. There are plenty of adults who are being diagnosed as neurodivergent later. So that's where the topic of accommodations, for example, Sean, let's say in a post-hire program, the context of, let's say if you're currently employed in an organization, how do you address accommodations? Let's say you're a manager who's neurotypical that's not neurodivergent. You may have an employee that, let's say you suspect may be neurodivergent, let's say from both a disadvantage or an advantage point of view. Again, we want to be careful not to assume that, okay, we see a disadvantage and they're neurodivergent. There's different skill sets that could be offered where they may be neurodivergent and this could be an advantage. So let's say an example of, and I'm talking broadly, of course, let's say an example of a post-hire program could be, how do you train managers who, let's say, can suspect that an employee is neurodivergent, whether from disadvantageous or advantageous outcomes we don't want to assume. How, as a manager, do you go about having that conversation with your employee to get to know them better?
Welcome back to the NITW Podcast. In today's episode, we'll be picking back up with part 2 of our conversation with Andrew Millin about his recent article in a point-counterpoint analysis of the methodologies and merits of neurodiversity employment programs. Where we left off from part 1, we were talking about factors that create effective programs and effective neuroinclusion, and we'll be getting into different organizational and management theories and how they overlap with and validate the practices of neuroinclusion programs. So please enjoy part 2 of our conversation with Andrew Millin. The effectiveness of a neuroinclusion program cannot be determined strictly from the words of the executive sponsor, right? Like, they have a role, especially that kind of cultural trickle down. That's something that we definitely see happen, and you referenced earlier. But yeah, if you're trying to evaluate a program, you need to hear from everyone, especially those folks that are living it every day and experiencing it. If they're the folks that you're trying to kind of most directly serve. So one of the other things that stood out to me reading the article as kind of most strongly validating the claim that, hey, there is evidence suggesting that these are having a positive impact and need to be better understood, was some of the connection and overlap with pre-existing and well-established and I would assume very well researched management theory and organizational theories, where the strengths of an individual pertain to the context that you put them in. For example, very similar to a strengths-based view of neuroinclusion, right? There's a lot of overlap there, but I think you did a good job of, the existing theories better than I do and can connect those dots a little better. So can you tell us a bit more about where those overlaps exist?
I'd say one theory that I mentioned in the article, I talked about neurodiverse leadership theory from Quinetta Roberson and her team. But there's another theory as well that I was reflecting on that we don't talk about in depth in the article, and that specifically is strategic human capital theory. So we see, especially in the strategic human resource management literature, that over time, HR has had to earn its spot at being strategic in organizations. So especially the University of South Carolina is very well known, especially where there are multiple strategic human resource management scholars that have published in this area and regularly engage with chief human resource officers. But as I was reflecting on that context I just shared, we could talk about broadly strategic human capital theory, where specifically there are not, when you think about knowledge, skills, specifically from neurodivergent individuals, but again, in your organization as a whole and how they can contribute to positive outcomes. We also, for example, in some of the readings and writings, I was reading regarding some of these scholars who are now at the University of South Carolina, this idea especially of talent as a competitive advantage. In the Harvard Business Review, for example, there's the classic Austin Pisano piece on neurodiversity as a competitive advantage. But from a theory point of view as well, with strategic human capital theory, we're already talking about what organizations in general that specifically their employees, again, could bring unique knowledge and skills that can contribute positively to these organizations. So that's one of the takeaways just from writing this article, that there are existing theories that are present versus, let's say, generating new theories. It's important that we reflect first on existing established theory, but then there are, of course, new theories of relevance, such as neurodiverse leadership theory. That theory was published 5 years ago, so that's an example of a newer theory. But there are both established theories, whether established more recently or established earlier in time, that especially could address why neurodivergent employees are important in workplaces and why neurodiversity employment programs distinctly are also important. But that's one of the different theories that we didn't write about directly in the publication, Strategic Human Capital Theory, and also reflecting on how taking care of your talent in and of itself is a competitive advantage in organizations.
Right. Yeah, there are certainly a number of those theories that probably were not written with neurodiversity on the mind of the authors, but if they're read through that lens, then they apply pretty directly. And that I found very encouraging. And then one other aspect of your writing that I wanted to unpack a little bit was you talk about the different types of programs, and you mentioned partner or external partner programs as one of those. Another kind of umbrella program type that you mentioned was post-hire programs. And both reading the article and also kind of thinking about my understanding of how different companies approach these efforts, post-hire program can encompass a really wide variety of things, from training to creating resources to, examining accommodation policy. It can take a lot of forms. So I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit. Like, what are some examples that fall under post-hire programs? And perhaps if you saw any that were more prevalent and or more effective than others.
So I appreciate you mentioning, Sean, that these programs the categories can cross over into one another. So that's where, especially from an academic point of view, with the little that we know about neurodiversity employment programs, our team takes this theoretical development approach in saying, let's clarify neurodevelopmental divergence. Let's talk about why clarifying that is important, but let's come to an initial consensus on how are we going to categorize these programs moving forward in the discourse about neurodiversity employment programs. So our goal was to differentiate. So we talk about, for example, the pre-hire programs. We bring up internships as well, but especially with even internships, for example, there are adults as well. There are different organizations that are offering internships for, let's say, people who do graduate from undergrad or who are switching careers. Those could be phrased as internships depending on the organization. Especially That's where some of these programs can mix. So to your post-hire program, for example, when we talk about post-hire program, in short, this is a program that is addressing, let's say, the target audience of employees, neurodivergent or not, that are already in the organization. So this is not about recruiting, let's say, employees in the door. This is about for employees who are already established in the given organization, addressing how they can learn more about neurodiversity at work. So I would say with post-hire, that's where we could see some of these categories blend together. So for example, if I'm reflecting, I think about, for example, EY. So EY, for example, has, I believe, there's centers for neuroinclusion. So that's where, for example, with those centers, it's both let's recruit neurodivergent talent, but it's also important that we are not siloing neurodivergent talent by itself. So that's where it's very important for organizations to walk a fine line with that. We don't want to stigmatize or re-traumatize people all over again. I go back to my dissertation. There are plenty of leaders who are concerned about their ADHD symptoms when their colleagues could detect them, for them to be stigmatized or be thought of as lesser than. So it's important for organizations to walk that fine line. But I would say, especially with post-hire programs, this is not about how it can get you in the door. It's addressing neurodiversity and you getting in the door. So for example, for an interview with a pre-hire program, let's say if you need interview accommodations, that's where that could be addressed, let's say in a pre-hire program. How do you address when you're applying for a job, having that conversation about needing accommodations? But we know, using that accommodation example, we know again that not everyone has the luxury or the privilege to be diagnosed as neurodivergent as a child. There are plenty of adults who are being diagnosed as neurodivergent later. So that's where the topic of accommodations, for example, Sean, let's say in a post-hire program, the context of, let's say if you're currently employed in an organization, how do you address accommodations? Let's say you're a manager who's neurotypical that's not neurodivergent. You may have an employee that, let's say, you suspect may be neurodivergent. Again, we want to be careful not to assume that, okay, we see a disadvantage and they're neurodivergent. There's different skill sets that could be offered where they may be neurodivergent and this could be an advantage. So let's say an example of, and I'm talking broadly, of course, let's say an example of a post-hire program could be, how as a manager do you go about having that conversation with your employee to get to know them better? So that's where, from the post-hire point of view, let's say training the current manager, neurodivergent or not, to be able to detect, how am I seeing, where am I, how can I detect and see what do I like that's benefiting the team, but what potentially are symptoms that, let's say, are making me feel uncomfortable? How do I have that conversation with my employee? And how do I address potentially, let's say, from a disadvantageous point of view, let's say if there are accommodations needed, what does that look like? So that would be an example of a post-hire program, again, with a manager and employee. What does it look like to provide resources and entitled services for that employee to succeed? Again, whether those are accommodations or whether that's, let's say, continuing education or other opportunities. Again, we want to be careful about framing neurodivergence as solely a disadvantage. It's both a disadvantage and an advantage at work.
Yeah. And that's only, one example of what a post-hire program could entail, that focus on kind of identification, disclosure, and accommodating. It could be countless other things. It could be about, reviewing the annual review process and language that goes into that. Their awareness campaigns across the organization to reach not even solely directly the neurodivergent employees, but a neuroinclusion program targeting the entire workforce at a company in an awareness campaign. It could be so many different things. So yeah, thanks for hashing that out. And as we're kind of like getting near the end of our time, I wanted to just ask, based on your research, your examination, and just kind of reflecting on in such detail the status of, I would say, the neurodiversity movement. What do you either expect or hope in terms of kind of future state of maybe the next 1 to 5 years of workplace neuroinclusion?
Great. Wow. What a packed and exciting question, man. So I would say especially with workplace neuroinclusion, again, we are seeing, especially we want to be aware as well moving forward of the global context. So very excited. I submitted my dissertation as a part of a symposium at the upcoming Academy of Management annual meeting in Philadelphia. And the symposium is titled ADHD in the East and West. My part of my dissertation, which was submitted along with other projects, will be a part of this symposium. And that's where we talk about how ADHD manifests similarly and differently between different global regions. So we have a combination of studies like mine from the United States, but also from Vietnam, from China, from Poland. So that's why I'd say, especially in the next 1 to 2 and 1 to 5 years, we see that whether in between different non-neurodivergent demographics. So let's say we're talking about race and ethnicity, or if we're talking about, let's say, globally where you are located, that's where neurodivergence can manifest differently. And that's where we need to understand, in addition to a diagnostic point of view, let's say, depending on, again, the given demographic, you have someone who may say, oh, that person could be neurodivergent. But in some cultures where, let's say, the given neurodivergent symptom or trait is not as salient, that could, let's say, not be perceived as divergent in a
Yeah,
sense,
totally.
and be detected. So that's where I would say moving forward for the next 1 to 5 years, having this global understanding that, but that said, understanding that if there's something just on my heart as like we wrap up from like the next 1 to 5 years, it's just simply different people talking with each other. Let's not stay in silos, whether it's scholars and
Yeah,
practitioners, whether it's people in a specific region. Let's have cross-regional conversations. Let's have conversations
yeah,
between scholars and practitioners, because we could see that even I had this conversation with someone else in the field. They're also pursuing their PhD, and they were mentioning that when we talk about the diverging and neurodivergence, that could be conceptualized differently depending on the group. Again, for a given neurodivergent trait, in one given demographic, that could be looked at or perceived as a trait that is diverging with what we would say is the norm. And maybe
yeah,
in another culture, maybe this trait would not be considered diverging. So that's where in the next 1 to 5 years, understanding these different points of view globally between different regions, understanding these different points of view between scholars and practitioners. But I feel like we're going to unpack in the next 1 to 5 years, what does it mean for something to diverge? Or what does it mean for a
yeah,
trait to diverge? What does that look like? I believe as we pursue neuroinclusion, my hope will be in the next 1 to 5 years, I'm hoping that overall stigma will go down, in that we see that these neurodivergent traits are essential to organizations. And again, that neurodivergence, it can offer advantages, but it's important that with listening to different points of view, that we honor different points of view as well as holistically. What I would not want to see is, let's say, someone who is having a hard time with their neurodivergence and needs to pursue help. I don't want their opinion to be overpowered, let's say, by, let's say, a superpower narrative. And we know, of course, neurodivergence can be a superpower, but that's where it's understanding there are different points of view at play, and let's give everyone the time of day to be listened to, versus, let's say, being quick to assume one way or the other. So I would say, in addition to these global perspectives, different groups connecting with one another, that there will be learning to do between fields in these next 1 to 5 years, where I'm seeing, at least in informal discourse between fields, that we all want to understand neurodiversity better, not only in organizations, but also just in life. We want to understand this better. We understand especially that neurodiversity is within the disability literature, but that's where there's still more to understand and more to unpack that will come with listening. But I'm excited in these next 1 to 5 years, I would say, us seeing again these similarities and differences more prevalently between different regions, so we could really see true global neuroinclusion.
yeah, yeah. I'm optimistic for both the global conversation and the destigmatization. I think I agree. I haven't heard much talk very recently about like kind of bridging the regional differences and bridging that conversation. I've heard the differences called out plenty of times, but yeah, I think that it's logical to kind of work to better understand perceptions and norms and support across different cultures and regions. That's super interesting. Okay, so Andrew, as we wrap up, I want to kind of point our listeners to where they can learn more. I am sure that after listening to this conversation, they'll want to take a look at the article, which I highly, highly recommend. It's an easy read. I'm not a big, academic paper reader, and I did not have a hard time reading through it at all. Super digestible and obviously very interesting to me. So yes, where can people find you, and where can they find the article?
Perfect. So you could find, I would say, especially LinkedIn is, if you are listening to this and you do not have a LinkedIn account already, please do me and Sean a favor and please create a LinkedIn account. I really appreciate, especially with LinkedIn, whether I am learning about new articles that are being published in different journals, or whether I am keeping track of different points of view from different chief human resource officers that I'm following at major firms. LinkedIn is a wonderful place to connect and be in the know with what is going on today. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn. My hyperlink is linkedin.com/n/ANMILLIN. So that is my LinkedIn profile. You could also find Sean on LinkedIn. You could also find Neurodiversity in the Workplace on LinkedIn. Please connect with us and please follow neurodiversity in the workplace, especially, where I give massive kudos that they are making the effort to engage with different scholars and practitioners in this space and keep all the different conversations and points of view going. To access the article specifically, you're welcome to reach out to me directly regarding that. The article can also be found on ResearchGate. It is another scholarly platform where articles are stored. There is a way to request the article through ResearchGate. So the Journal of Organizational Behavior, they do work with ResearchGate as well to have a process in which authors can be contacted through that platform and articles can be inquired about through that platform. So again, the title of the article is Neurodiversity Right, the Case for Neurodiversity Employment Programs. And again, the easiest ways to access that article, you are welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you are welcome to inquire about the article on ResearchGate.
Perfect. Great. Well, I'm sure some traffic will be going that way. And yeah, as you said, LinkedIn is where a lot of us advocates kind of commune and share ideas and psych each other up and try to keep the momentum of the movement. So we will see you all there. And yeah, really appreciate you giving us your time today, Andrew, and continuing your efforts trying to further our shared mission. So really appreciate you being in the space. I'm sure we'll see you at a conference soon, and I will look forward to it. But thank you for your time today and joining us on the show.
Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And Sean, it's been great. A great future ahead for everybody.